Today, what we're going to focus on is part 2 of this series that we started last month on Family History Revealed. And so that was a very exciting meeting last month. We had Tony Tran here. And if you want to see, or you weren't here and you want to see his presentation, the Iowa City Public Library is recording these, and those presentations are available on their website. Those are linked through the Facebook page for this group, and so you can see several of the different programs that we've had over the past few months on that website. So today what we're going to focus on is finding new relatives. That's the focus of the meeting tonight. And we do have topics scheduled for the rest of 2017, and so we do meet the fourth Tuesday of each month. I see a few new faces here, and so thanks for coming. And I see some continuing participants of the Iowa City DNA Interest Group. So October 24th, we'll focus on identifying and predicting relationships. And this is going to be more sort of workshop oriented to deal with sort of what you expect to have in terms of the amount of DNA shared between certain relatives, given the level of distance between those relatives. And then November, we'll focus on doggy DNA tests, which there's several different doggy DNA testing options out there. And so we'll do an exploration of those. So today what we're going to focus on is the second part of finding new relatives. And so relative matching is a common feature of personal genome services. So these direct-to-consumer DNA tests, they will match you with other individuals, identifying the relationship with those individuals in their database. And so this can be used to search for, as Tony Tran was searching for his biological grandfather. They can be used to search for relatives, and also they can be used to discover relatives as well. Sometimes these relatives are unknown to you prior to taking that test. That's going to be the focus of tonight. And using the relationship predictions, common connections with others in the database, that allows you to identify potential shared ancestors that you have with these individuals, and sometimes these can reveal surprises in terms of relationships. And so the DNA matching feature is offered as part of the Ancestry DNA service. It's really the bread and butter of the Ancestry DNA service, connected with the family tree building within Ancestry.com. Family Tree DNA, MyHeritage DNA, all of these genealogically focused websites that have DNA matching at their core. 23andMe has DNA matching as part of that service as well. And so all of these are cases where by taking a DNA test, you are matched with others in the database, and the relationships are estimated between you and your cousins. So this story just recently came out, so September 17th. So she took a DNA test to get health information. She found 3 half-siblings. And so this is a story focused on an individual that thought she knew her biological parents, and then by participating in 23andMe, submitting a test, this person happened to find 2 half-siblings in that database. By finding those 2 half-siblings, the individual has now identified that she was conceived through a sperm donor, and has since found another half-sibling out there in the MyHeritage DNA database. And so this is a potential result that can happen whenever you do submit a DNA test, as it sort of changes your view on sort of what your biological history is. All of this is enabled by the fact that with genetics, we inherit these pieces of DNA in large chunks from common ancestors that we share with other individuals very recently within our past. So I've shown this illustration a number of times, but this is just to illustrate that this blue piece of DNA, this blue chromosome here in this man, is transmitted to his children here. That can be broken up and exchanged to make a blue-gray piece of DNA here in this chromosome. Those are then 50-50 chance of going on to the next generation. They can break down even more. And so these segments, these chunks of DNA that are identical between individuals are an indicator that we have a common ancestor. And this is just showing this one blue chromosome, considering all of this chromosome pair here and these two common relatives, the 22 pairs of autosomes that we have within the human genome. That gives a lot of power to identify relatives in the database that are within about 4 or 5 generations removed. And so this is the case of being able to use this to estimate relationships because of this identity by descent that's identified between a tester and other folks in the database. So I shared this story last time just to illustrate that, here's a bunch of chunks of DNA that I share with a half-first cousin. And so we have a family history story that my grandfather had a child by another woman that was not my grandmother. I got my half-first cousin, or my hypothesized half-first cousin, to do a 23andMe test so that we could test this family story. And sure enough, whenever I compare my DNA with his DNA, we have these 10 different pieces of our genomes that we share that are identical. 6.35% of our genomes are identical, and this is what would be predicted for a half-first cousin relationship if we share a common grandfather. And so that was a case of using the service to essentially investigate a oral history story within our family. Actually, it turns out, so I said I would follow up on this story at this meeting, it turns out I really didn't need to invest the money by getting my cousin tested. I just had to wait. And so I've also taken my Ancestry DNA results and uploaded them into Family Tree DNA, and so another database. And so my test results are in that database. Their Family Finder is the same tool as Ancestry DNA. It matches you with relatives across your entire genome. And I happened to get these two matches that came up as pretty close cousins of mine within the Family Tree DNA database. And so this happens to be a father-son set here, common name here. And they showed up as estimated between second and third cousins. That was curious. That's pretty close, and those names are not familiar to me. Furthermore, I've tested my Y chromosome, and so this piece of DNA that males get from their father. So I have a Y chromosome test within the Family Tree DNA database. Those two individuals came up as really close matches to my Y chromosome as well. And so because they're close matches across my entire genome, and they're close matches to my Y chromosome, that's pretty indicative of which particular line of my family tree that they're on. They're along this paternal line. That was even more curious because they do not have McAllister as their surname. I essentially know all my males with McAllister out to about fourth cousin level because I've investigated that line of my family. This is actually a fourth cousin once removed here, and so pretty far back that this individual tested, and we share that McAllister surname. Turns out that this is actually the half-first cousin there. This is his brother, and this is the son of his brother. And so this is a case where this connection is through my grandfather and this other woman, and so this person went in and created their tree within Family Tree DNA, and so I showed you the results in 23andMe of my half-first cousin. Well, here's his brother. Some communication between me and my half-first cousin revealed that, yes, his brother did have this child, and someone that he really didn't claim as his child, and this person was searching to verify that story, and happened to find this McAllister relative in the database, totally confused, dumbfounded, and so I was able to sort of set the record straight on this particular event of paternity, and the fact that there was this particular event of paternity back here for a man that died when I was 2 years old. And so here's a case where there's unwritten family history here that was unknown, giving rise to this guy's grandfather through my grandfather. So, this is an interesting case of unwritten family history. This person, was wanting to create a tree that represented this, and I said, sure. That tree was actually viewed by a cousin on this side of the family, and that person was quite upset with this person revealing the tree of the ancestry here going back to McAllister. And I said, well, just make it private so that she can't see. And so this represents that privacy of individuals, of this individual having a child with McAllister, and then the paternity event there. But also I think it sort of shows this issue that, even though this is a fairly old event, some people hold sort of the oral history personally, and you have to navigate this space of dealing with individuals and their thoughts and feelings about their history. And so what I want to focus on a little bit tonight is sort of this position that we put ourselves in with DNA testing on navigating between biological family members and these newly discovered family members that we get through DNA test results. And so the first story I want to deal with is by Karen Kopp, and before I have her come up, I happened to be invited to be on Iowa Public Radio in the summer of 2015, and so this is 2 years ago that Charity Nebbe was going to do a program on DNA testing, and she got in contact with me, and I said, well, I have a friend that has a really, really good DNA testing story, and I'll see if she might be interested in participating in the radio segment on this. She agreed, and so what I'm going to start out with is this recording from 2015. It's a 7-minute segment that I've extracted out of this, but I think it's really nice because it was such a fresh telling of this particular series of events that led to this discovery from DNA testing. So I'm just going to let this play for 7 minutes.
And you did get matched with someone. Tell me what happened.
Yeah, so I sent in my test at the end of April, and then at the end of May, I had an email from someone who was a close match. They were identified as a cousin within 23andMe. And 23andMe has a interior email system where you can contact people without revealing who you are. So it can be private. So when that person who looked like a cousin contacted me, I was it just caught me by surprise because I thought, what? And I didn't know of I didn't know who this could be. And then because I had also sent in a kit for my mother and I could see my mother's reports and mine, then I realized it wasn't a first cousin. It was a first cousin once removed. So that meant she was the daughter of one of the 22 cousins on my mother's side.
Okay,
and
you have a lot of cousins.
I do, yeah.
But she was interested in getting in touch with you because
she was adopted.
All right, she was looking for her birth mother.
Yes.
Which had to be one of your 22 cousins.
Yes.
And
yes.
Did you have any idea before you got a message from her that any of your cousins had given up a child?
I didn't. No. So then I talked to my 2 younger sisters, and we were speculating, like, who could this be? And I was also, I talked to, all of my friends who would listen to say, well, I don't know what to do.
Right. Were you worried that you were opening up a can of worms?
Yes. I didn't want to turn someone's life upside down if this wasn't something that they wanted to be out there. And I exchanged a few emails with April, who is the young woman who had been adopted, and she had learned a year earlier what her birth mother's name was. So then at that point it was easy, and I could also tell from 23andMe by the percentage of genetic material that we shared that she was a first cousin once removed. So that helped too.
Right. So once you connected the dots and you knew which cousin had given her up for adoption, still you have information that you weren't necessarily supposed to have, and
Right.
it wasn't a simple thing. It was pretty complicated.
Yes, because the April's birth mother was mentally ill and was in an institution. So I contacted one of the cousins in that family, and we talked by phone, and there was this dilemma of this information. We felt the information belonged to April, who her birth mother was, but then at the same time, it was terrible news to give her that that her mother was, in an institution. But then I felt that it wasn't. I was excited about it, of course, when I first heard from April, but I knew it wasn't my information to share. So my cousin decided that she wanted to get in touch with April, and so then she contacted my cousin Linda, who's the birth mother, and asked her if it was okay to get in touch with April, and it was. Okay. So then from that point on, the two sisters of Linda were in touch with April.
So her aunts.
Yes, her aunts.
Her biological aunts. Mm-hmm. And your cousin, who was institutionalized, also became very ill, and she was put into hospice care.
Yeah.
What happened next?
Well, so the timeline for this is interesting because I sent my test in at the end of April. April, the person, got in touch with me at the end of May, and then toward the end of June, I contacted my cousins, and then my cousin Linda actually died last week on the 28th. Oh. So my cousins had been in touch with April and were able to somehow all decide to, when Linda went into hospice care, then they all tried to get out to Miami, and they got there, but only April got there. Well, I guess my other cousin got there half an hour before Linda died, but April was able to spend the day with Linda before she died. Wow. And I don't think that Linda was responsive, but at least it was,
a moment of closure.
A moment of closure, and just this sort of strange thing that April was there with her mother when she was born, and then also at the very end of her life.
So have you had a chance to talk to April about what that means to her to have made these connections?
Well, I've only emailed with her because I felt that it was her aunts. I wanted them to, have first contact, although everyone in my family is so excited about, a new relative. And we didn't know when my cousin was institutionalized, we just didn't really know a lot about what was going on in her life. So yes, I've only been in touch with April through email, but my mother has been in touch with her, and my mother would be her great aunt, and so my mother is saying, like, send her a picture, send her this, send her that, and she sounds like a wonderful young woman, and her two aunts are delighted to know their niece, and she looks so much like her birth mother Linda, so that's kind of startling too. So April is. I think she had been searching for a long time, and so she was very, very happy to learn who her birth mother was. And she actually knew a bit about the mental illness because she could see the medications that the birth mother was on when she gave her up for adoption.
Okay, so she suspected that there was
Yeah.
this history.
Yeah.
And so this story is really still unfolding, but what
Yeah.
an amazing connection that really you couldn't have made in any other way.
No. And what's strange is that April was searching for her birth mother, and I just took the test kind of on a whim, just out of curiosity. And so it was, I guess the thing is, you might have a family tree, but it just emphasized that point that perhaps not everything is on it,
Right.
or everyone.
So now I'm going to bring Karen up. So that was done really fresh, and so it just was a series of events where just after Karen had sort of learned of that story had played out, she was on the radio talking about it, and so I think that really captures the essence of it. So first, sort of, it's been 2 years, and so could you give us sort of an update on where the story has gone in the last 2 years?
Well, I think that a lot has changed in April's life because since in 2 years she's gotten married and had a child, and so I think her sense of family has changed in that she has a bigger known family now, and I was emailing her and I said that I haven't met her yet, and so and the thing also is I don't really know the children of my cousins that well anyway, but I do email back and forth a bit with April. And so I said that, I mostly know her through Facebook. And through Facebook, I, can kind of know some things about her personality. I mean, she's very upbeat, and she works as a counselor for children. And so she's a very active Facebook poster and has, different messages and videos. And so she was agreeing that, that was mainly the way that I know her. And so I told her that, I see a lot of really cute photos of her son Castile, and she has upbeat numerous posts, and that she's a relentless advocate of doing the right thing, plus mental and social health advocate. So how's that in a nutshell? And then that's what I had emailed her. Because I wanted to check with her again before I did this. Just one of my cousins was sort of saying, if you're going to talk about this, you need to have April's permission because it's her story. And I was like, okay, yeah, I get it. So I thought definitely I would check with her again when I did this. So I would hope someday to meet her. I think that it has meant a lot for my two cousins in that family, her aunts, to get to know her. And I think also one thing that I was asking April, what was different for her and her sense of family, and she said that, well, one thing is that when we connected, she was kind of at a low point in terms of her relationship with her adoptive mother. So her adopted father had passed away, maybe, I don't know, somewhere between 2013 and 2015, I guess. And then also her adopted grandmother, who she was very fond of. And then her adoptive mother, I'm not exactly sure what went on, but I think maybe they just kind of grew apart a bit and, didn't have much of a connection anymore. So I think she was also searching for connection as well as, to find relatives. And one of my cousins I know has, April lives in New Orleans now, so she's been out to visit her to see the baby. And I know that my mom would really like to meet her too. It's just the matter of, traveling with a 96-year-old from Texas to New Orleans, and trying to figure out what's possible. So, and then, I think that, right after I was talking with my brother and my sisters, about who knew about this. And I said in the interview that I had talked with my younger sisters, and I have a older sister and older brother, and I don't think my brother knew anything, but my older sister did. And I guess for some reason I didn't really check with my mom. I guess I didn't want my mom to be, I don't know, to go off on a tangent, and just, not that she would mind, but I guess I didn't want her to say something about it to someone else until we were ready.
So I like to use this, especially working with students that are considering doing DNA tests, as an example of how doing a DNA test, you can put yourself in this position of needing to navigate between your known family and this person that you've discovered. And I think your telling of the story and your example is wonderful in terms of how you sort of navigated that space. Are there things that you could share in terms of sort of your thought process and sort of procedures on what you did whenever you made that discovery, and how you say contacted your cousins and things like that?
I think that when I first got the email from April, I was surprised, and I didn't really know what to do, and I really wanted to respond to her, but because I didn't know, I did a lot of Googling, and I thought, well, I think she grew up in Florida. That's where the adoption took place. And but because I have so many cousins, and I was trying to think, which cousins lived in Florida? And I didn't know, which side of the family it was on. And then one of my sisters was saying, whoa, don't respond to her, And I thought, because I guess she just thought this is just going to be trouble. And then actually another friend also was telling me I wouldn't respond to her. But at the same time, I was intensely curious.
Why were you shocked? Did they give a reason?
I don't know. I guess just because they thought that it would be bad for someone. So I think that just because it was, would perhaps disclose something that someone didn't want everyone to know. But then when April came back with a little bit later in that exchange and mentioned that she thought her birth mother's name was Linda, then I knew which family it was. But I didn't know that Linda had had a child. And, Linda was, I guess, from her 20s on, she was diagnosed with schizophrenia. Of course, that's a collection of symptoms. So I never exactly understood what was going on. And she was present as a young person and then gone. So then I emailed my cousin Becky, because she's my sort of age mate cousin, and she talked with her sister Nancy, and they called Linda at the institution, and Linda was sometimes kind of with it and sometimes not, but she didn't seem to, they thought that at least they should be respectful and do that. And Linda said, sure, okay, So then they wanted to contact April through Facebook, but then that didn't, I guess Facebook messaging, I get a little confused with that. For some reason it didn't work. And so then I emailed April through 23andMe and then pasted a note in there from my cousins, and then she was able to contact them through there. And I think they probably did a little bit of emailing back and forth and talking, and then suddenly my cousin Linda was in hospice care, and so I only got the email about hospice care like in the morning of July 28th, and I think maybe they must have known the day before. So somehow April was able to get out there immediately from New Orleans to Miami and get there in the morning. And she found great comfort in, holding Linda's hand and thanking her for bringing her into the world. So it was very touching for moving what April said about the encounter with her birth mother. So
I think that piece of getting the information from April in terms of who her birth mother, the name that she had, and so the research that had been done there and have an ID, then you're sort of there as the conduit of the current context. And so yes, I do know that person, and I do know that all the cousins of that person, siblings of that person as well, and their state also.
yeah, so I think that what was always kind of strange was just how this inadvertent thing I did was very meaningful for someone else. I mean, meaningful for my family too, but mostly for April. And the whole reason I took the test was, my husband Steve took the test, and so I thought, well, I'll take it too. And but it was, there was no deep motivation. It was just out of curiosity, but then found out something significant.
So what I'd like to do is hold questions from the audience until the end. I have a couple more individuals here that are going to share their story. And so what we'll do now is go on to Maureen. So you go ahead and stay there. I'll have Maureen come up. And so Maureen Neiman is a colleague of mine in the Department of Biology. She's one of the early adopters of 23andMe. And so she did it quite a bit before me as a platform. You probably did it back when it was expensive. I did it when it was cheap. And so, Maureen, go ahead and tell us your story.
Okay. So like Bryant said, I did 23andMe, I think in 2011 maybe. It was $200 or so. And I did it, I think as a biologist, it was just exciting to be able to look into your ancestry. And so my heritage, I knew my heritage, I knew it was Ashkenazi Jewish. I didn't expect any surprises in terms of my ancestry. And I didn't find any. As I tell my friends, I'm the most boring person I know. I'm like 98% Ashkenazi Jewish, and had relatives popping up that I knew about. And my husband was very excited about 23andMe, also Ashkenazi Jewish, did 23andMe as well, and also then he actually sprung for many of my family, which is where this is now going. So this is an aside, my husband and I find out that we're like 8th cousins on 23andMe. That's not the story. This is common in Ashkenazi Jews. Because of this sort of identity by descent that Bryant was talking about, we share a lot of fairly recent ancestors. So when you are an Ashkenazi Jew, is there anyone else here? I know, Kyle, you're half Ashkenazi Jewish. Anyone else here of Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry who has done 23andMe? Steve? Yeah. For real? Huh, who knew? So when you are an Ashkenazi Jew, you have like thousands of cousins, because Ashkenazi Jews are so inbred. I think they all do 23andMe, so that you have many, many relatives in the database. So I'm constantly getting emails from people who are, my relatives. And usually I've often ignored them because I get a lot of them. So in February of 2015, I got an email from some guy who said he said, hey, we're like third cousins or something. And I was like, yeah, whatever. I wasn't really blowing him off, but I just wasn't that excited about it because this happened a lot. But then he emailed me again a few weeks later, and he said, I contacted you, and because my husband Bennett had done some other relatives, he said, I've also contacted this person and that person, who turned out to be my mom and her brother, my uncle. And he said, I'd really, really be interested to know more about your family history. And so I said, paid attention, and I said, okay, yeah, let's share family histories. So I told him mine, and I wrote to him and asked him his family history. And Bryant, do you have the email that he wrote back to me? So maybe go forward to, this is the guy who wrote me. His name, Michael Anthony. And we appeared to be third cousins, and he wrote me this email where I said, tell me your story, not expecting anything super interesting, except I did observe from his picture that his skin tone was darker than my other Ashkenazi relatives. He says, Maureen, my data indicates that I too am predominantly Ashkenazi Jewish. It is a long story. I thought I was an African American, only to recently learn that my biological father was a Jewish man from Vienna who relocated to the UK before coming to Chicago. My guess is that our relationship is connected to him. His name is Adolf Wirth, shortened from Wirtschafter. I am in the process of learning more about my bio father and his bloodline. If you have other thoughts, please share. Thanks, Michael. So this was very interesting, and I got excited when I saw this last name Worth, because that actually was a name that I knew about in my family. So I immediately talked to my mother, and my mom was from a Jewish family who had immigrated to the United States from Hungary in the 1930s and 40s during World War II. And she hardly had any relatives because most of her family had been killed by Nazis during the war. And she was very excited because the idea of having more relatives was neat to her. And so she gave me the sort of family story, and this is not an irrelevant aside. She was sick. She had pancreatic cancer. She was very sick. And so but this was something, this was very exciting for her. It was this kind of like ray of just fun and hope, and just something that kind of took her mind off her illness to connect with this person. So she told me a family history to send to him. I sent it to him. To make a long story short, we figured out that Adolf Worth was my grandmother's first cousin. So if we go to these pictures, my grandmother is this woman right here. This is my mom's mother. This is Adolf Wirtschafter, which was a picture sent by the Wirtschafters. And in looking at this picture, we were like, oh my God, that's grandma. Like, we didn't know that they had ever been in pictures together. They're clearly connected. This is Michael Anthony, and then this is a cousin that my mom knew named David Wirtschafter, and another cousin that she knew, Michelle Andre, who's also Wirtschafter. My mom knew these two people. This is David, this guy, David Wirtschafter, this is his uncle, Michael Anthony, and they're about the same age. And so this white Ashkenazi Jewish family connected with this black Baptist Chicago family. They're all living in Chicago for the first time in 2015. So this guy's grandfather is that guy's father. And it turned out that Adolf Wirtschafter, who had been head of Paramount Pictures in Europe in the 30s, had come to the US in the 40s and had been a traveling like vacuum salesman, had stopped by Michael Anthony's mother's house, connected on some level with his mother, who was married to someone else and ended up having a kid with her. And so Michael Anthony, who is this kid here in the middle, had grown up, he had 5 siblings. He grew up on the south side of Chicago in a very black neighborhood, black Christian neighborhood, but he grew up always feeling like he was different. So he had lighter skin, kids I guess called him white boy, and he said he always felt a little bit different, and he grew up with a really, really wonderful man who knew that Michael was not his biological son, but raised him as if he were. And he now, once the story all came together, he remembered Adolf Wirtschafter coming by for dinner on occasion when he was a child, and he was just treated as a family friend. So my mom was incredibly excited to make this new connection to family, and so was Michael. And Michael and his wife, and Michael and his daughter, they called my mom and they talked on the phone on a number of occasions through this period of time in the spring of 2015, and they actually made plans to come up to Minneapolis, which is where my family is from, to meet my mom and to meet my mom's mother, who had Alzheimer's and who was in a nursing home, but just to make more connections with family. And so they made plans to meet in May of 2015, and my mom actually died in April. And so Michael and his wife actually flew up from Chicago for the day to come to the celebration of life that we did for my mom. So they showed up at my family's house on this day that we were gathered as a family to celebrate my mom. We had never met them, and they walked in, and it made this incredibly huge impression to see this family that we had never known, that we had never met in person, and they came there to honor my mom. And so they're incredibly lovely people. He also turns out to have been Bill Clinton's private investigator in the 90s. Just a fascinating family. They sing gospel, and they do all these sort of black Christian things that white Jews don't typically do, and they've been lovely to connect to, and I've continued to be in touch with them. We're all Facebook friends. I've bought Michael Anthony's new gospel CD, which is again not a kind of music that I usually listen to, and it's been just a really fun, really positive experience for me getting to know this new branch of my family. Michael, for a 66-year-old man who's just found out that he's not who he thought he was, handled it incredibly well. And it's really brought, I think, a lot of meaning and a lot of sense to a life that was a little bit confusing in some ways. So Yes, I hit another message from Michael. Maureen, you're a fantastic investigator. I just set him straight. That was not me. That was my mother. As you can imagine, this is all very overwhelming for me. I'm 64 years old and just learned 3 weeks ago that Adolf is my father. To now learn about you, your mom, and others is absolutely amazing. To think that I have this extended family that I knew absolutely nothing about is a lot to get my head around. That said, I'm unbelievably thankful that I finally know the truth and I fully embrace it. So I think it's made a huge difference for him. And this is sort of the fun part. You know, Michael, Anthony, and I, I'm 99.9% European, you know, which means 100, right? He's 61.2% European, and then, you know, the sort of the cool part, then, you know, he's African American too. So he's 7.6% Sub-Saharan African. Of course, I am not, which reflects the different sides of our ancestry. But it's really been a fun connection, and it was one of the most fun and kind of heartwarming things to happen to me in a really hard year when I lost my mom, but to discover a new part of my family that made a big difference for her too.
Thanks for sharing your story. I'm not going to sort of prompt any questions. I'll wait until the end and let the audience ask questions. And so lastly, I'd like to bring Bev up here, Bev Sabo. She's been part of our group, and so she's a committed attender to the DNA interest group, and so I'll have her come up and tell her story.
You're going to put that slide.
I'm going to put that slide up.
Well, to begin with, my known direct ancestry is only Norwegian. And curiously, the people in my family who have done testing, my 3 siblings and I, a double first cousin, and a maternal aunt. By the time we thought about it, it was too late to get anybody else out of the next generation. Curiously, this story, I'm going to start at the end, at the bottom here with LB. Sometime in the last year, there was a match posted on Ancestry.com of a second cousin, but no further information. And this person matched with all 6 of us, 6 of the people in my family, with my siblings, my double first cousin, and my maternal aunt. But this person didn't post anything. In January of this year, another person joined Ancestry and posted information, and that's the JY in this history. And he matched as a second to third cousin. The reality is he's a second cousin once removed. When I looked at his tree that he had posted, I knew exactly what family he fit into because he mentioned people, or the people in his family fit in the family with my would-be maternal, that's maternal great-grandmother. And what's curious about her, she was born in 1849 in the Lillehammer area of Norway, and she emigrated in 1856 or 1858 with a maternal aunt and her husband. The family that remained in Norway thought that she had died because a younger sibling had died. Subsequently, in the last several years, I've made contact with a third cousin once removed in Norway, Catherine, who filled me in on the history of the family that remained in Norway and actually sent me a picture of what would be my great-great-grandmother, Betsy. And clearly, when you look at that and the matches, and LB also was a match as a second to third cousin with JY. LB is an adopted person, much like your story, looking for her biological family. She has a daughter, and she just thinks it would be helpful for her daughter to know more about the family history. So clearly, she fits somehow into this family in that place, and that's kind of a piece in progress. I know that looking at the connections of Nina's children, there were 2 sons in that family, which one would be my grandfather, and then would be an uncle that makes for the descendancy down to JY. and the others were all daughters. I tried to look through, I know quite a bit about some of those would be first cousins of my mother, because my mother had been working on genealogy for several years, and it actually corresponded with those cousins. So because nobody sends any letters anymore, you really don't have those sorts of things. And my mother never threw anything out. So she saved all the letters of the correspondence with her first cousins. So I have those, but the first cousins were not very enlightening, and I think some of it's just being Norwegian. You have to understand, they don't talk about themselves in any way. So when my mother would write and say, can you tell me about your family? What are your brothers doing? Or, or your sisters and who's in their family and what's going on? The letters read like this. My sister, and then a first name, has 2 sons. And that's it. So it's really hard to kind of piece together some of that. LB, the person who's the adoptee in this story, has information that her parents were very young, and that's why her biological parents were very young, and that's why she was placed for adoption, and that a great aunt had correspondence with her adoptive parents to get reports on how she was doing when she was growing up, so that there was some contact. And I think my best guess is she fits into this family amongst all of these people. And the question is, I think that I have given her information about the people in the family, and I'm sort of torn between, I think it's sort of her responsibility to look further into those people than for me to do it. Because as in all families, there are some parts of the history that I've learned from public records that you find it in a lot of families, but sometimes it's not something you necessarily want to tell someone. If they find it for themselves, fine, under the circumstances of this. So as you mentioned, it's still a work in progress.
Still a work in progress. And each of you have sort of pointed out this aspect of using resources, one of them family members and the family history information there, to sort of piece together where someone fits in that may not know much about their own family history. And so it's this issue of sort of piecing them in and figuring out where they belong. And so what we'll do now is open it up if anybody has particular questions to any of our panelists. And wait for the microphone, because we are recording it, and we don't get you on the recording unless you have the microphone. And so if you'd raise your hand, Maeve will bring the mic to you. So while she's moving over, I want to thank all of our panelists. I appreciate you sharing with us. We'll thank you again at the end, but thank you for sharing your stories with us.
I really enjoyed your stories, and as an adoptive person, I didn't know that's what this would be about tonight. And when I found some family history 30 years ago, they just said there's no rule book for this. And I think each of your stories still says that now 30 years later, there's still not a rule book for this. I wonder, I'd like to hear from each of you, what would you do differently? How would you have gone into this, looking back now? Would you have done anything differently?
I think for me, I probably wouldn't have done anything differently. I think when it happened, I also thought, well, why didn't I check with my older sister, Chris, because she would have known about it. And I think that, mostly, when I'm trying to figure something out, then I talk to other people and, what do you think? And for some reason, I felt more comfortable asking my younger sisters about that. But I think that, and also it took me a long time to respond to April. I waited a month before I responded to her, partly because of, people that I thought were smarter than me that were saying, don't respond to her, and, so I knew that responding to her would open something up, and that I needed to be cautious about it, because it was, not necessarily going to reveal something about my, immediate family, but more my extended family, so.
I think I just would have gotten Michael Anthony and his family to Minneapolis earlier so they could have met my mom while she was alive. I think that would have been incredibly meaningful. So that's with hindsight.
I don't know that there's anything I could have done differently in a sense. I think that there are a lot of things in many families that aren't spoken about. And so that comes into play with it. And what's curious, traditionally, in Norway, because I can only speak to really that ethnic group or country, a lot of things aren't talked about. And traditionally, women were often pregnant before marriage because you needed to prove that you could produce a child to help work the land. And so there are a lot of pregnancies out of wedlock or whatever because of the social conditions and all sorts of things. And it's real curious to me in looking at people who, in their immigration to this country, didn't want to talk about those things, and those things were terrible and awful. I can remember my grandmother and that generation speaking about it in those kinds of terms, and I thought when you really look back at the history, the families from those areas are just replete with that, and it's part of, if you look at the anthropological or sociological studies that have been done on it, it's just typical. And curiously, the church records all tell you whether the parents were married or not. So whether you want to know or not, I mean, you can find it out. It's clearly there. And in some instances, the pastor of the parish writes down how many children out of wedlock the people have had.
That seems very direct.
Yes, right there.
Well, there's another thing
Yeah.
that enters in that I've noticed is the one generation knows, it's no secret. The children know, it's no secret. But since they all know, the next generation doesn't hear it. It's not talked about, not because it's a secret, but because everybody knows it's not news. And so as a third generation or fourth generation, you say, oh, so these things aren't necessarily secrets. It's just that nobody finds it interesting to talk about. We all know. And also, from the Norwegian standpoint, the attitude very much was regional. That in some areas, they didn't really care much. This is the way it was. In some other regions, it was a great scandal. So it's a kind of interesting thing, like you say, for a Norwegian in this whole thing.
The other piece of it, there are family stories that get passed down that are frequently in error. It's sort of like playing telephone. And there was one of those in my family where people said that this fellow emigrated from Norway. His wife died in Norway and they had a small child and he came all by himself. Imagine that. And this is the way the story goes. And I still have a first cousin of my father's who's still alive. She's 92 and very alert. And when some relatives in Norway were writing a book about the heritage and the emigration of people from one of the farms in Norway to this country, I said, there's this tale or this story that's been told. I heard it from my grandmother, and yet when you look in the records, it's not true at all. His wife emigrated with him. She died in Wisconsin, and he just moved on elsewhere, married somebody else. But my cousin, my second cousin, or my dad's first cousin, it's terrible. The story's all wrong because that's not the way I heard it from her dad. Well, her dad was the youngest of 10 or 11 children in the family where it was the father, and you can imagine how that got transferred down. So, I mean, people don't even want to believe when you find in the records. I mean, she said, the records have to be wrong. Well, I don't think so.
Other questions?
I heard you mention 23andMe. That seems to be a key source or resource for doing the kind of genealogy that you are talking about, meaning the DNA type genealogy. Am I right about that? Is 23andMe the place to go?
It's one of the options, and so both Karen and Maureen they made their connection to the individual on that particular testing platform. But there are other options as well, and so the service, and I think our projector went off because I had it on mute, but the one slide I showed has the different services that do this relative matching. 23andMe is one of those. Ancestry DNA matches you with others in their database if you do an Ancestry DNA test. Family Finder of Family Tree DNA service, that matches you with relatives in their database. And then also there's MyHeritage DNA as well that matches you with other members of their database. And so there's several different services that offer this DNA matching.
I noticed you do add the DNA phrase in there. So you're saying this is specifically about DNA matching. That's what this whole meeting is about.
Correct. And so
Okay.
this is a case of taking your saliva, spitting it in a tube, sending it to one of these services. Within a few weeks, you then get an email that says, oh, your results are ready. You log in and boom, you find you have this new cousin that you didn't know about. Or not, you might find that the closest person related to you is some fifth cousin, and tracing your common connection with that individual may be very difficult as well. And so it depends on who is out there in the database and how closely related you are to them.
And this used to be expensive, but it's not so bad anymore.
Around $100, depending on what service you're
Okay,
doing.
thank you.
Yes.
We have lots of things at the library to help you learn more about it.
And you can come to this meeting once a month, and we'll have different topic each month that will also help you understand your results as well.
So I think we have time for one more question, and you have.
I was curious, I have done 23andMe and Ancestry DNA, but I'm kind of stuck with where to go from there, like which cousins to pay attention to, how far out to care about, and then what to do with that as far as like, I just what to do once you know that you have all these cousins. I mean, where do you go and what do you pay attention to?
Well, I'll just start with and say it really depends on what you want out of your efforts. And so that's sort of the first thing, is defining what you want out of your efforts. And any of you guys want to sort of speak to that on where you go?
I would just mention, I think originally, a lot of people start going with themselves and going back in a direct ancestry line. And then you may discover after you do that to find relationships, it may be because siblings of those people. And so I guess most usually, it seems like people start with a direct ancestry line, and then you may find that you need to go further out in a particular area.
But you have the option to contact people, like you're given this ranked list of relatives from closest to most distant. And with each of those relatives, if they have enabled contact, you can then contact them. So me, with my Jewish heritage and my 1,000, second to fifth cousins, I generally don't do much with those. But the closer ones I will. I mean, I had this funny thing where I contacted this person who it turns out that I already knew, was like, so my dad's like, well, that's Mike Rich. Like, of course that's, but I was all excited because I thought I discovered somebody new because they were really close. But it turns out that I knew him already. But you can choose, if you want. I mean, it's sensibly you start with the closer relatives, and that, as Bryant said, is going to depend on who's in the database. A really interesting little twist with my story is that different groups of people tend to do different services. Like there are services that have reached out more to say African Americans, and so they'll have more African Americans in their databases. 23andMe is very heavily Jewish because I think people do the service, they tell their family members do it. So if you do, which service you do will dictate which results you get. Michael Anthony had intended to do an African American focused database, but he accidentally did the wrong one, which is how he discovered all of his Jewish relatives. So if he hadn't done 23andMe, that part of his story would have remained obscure.
And then there's some databases that are good for Native Americans too, right?
Right, and so, and in terms of the ancestry composition, there are specialized databases. But just I mean, in this case, the spectrum of relatives you're being matched with really depends on who's been recruited or essentially brought into being a customer of that particular service. And there are differences among those companies in sort of what their spectrum of clientele looks like. As Maureen mentioned, in terms of 23andMe and Ashkenazi Jewish. So at this point, I think I'll stop with the recording, and if there needs to be any further discussion, you have any questions, we have time to mingle afterwards, but we'll sort of stop recording at this point. Okay. Thanks for our presenters.